Why do horror movies feel so empty? A genre that I felt once left chills to the spine now just leaves me feeling disappointed. I just can't help but wonder what went wrong with horror movies. If you go anywhere on the internet and ask, what are the best horror movies? You're going to be met with a list that mostly includes movies from before the year 2000. Of course, a couple movies released in recent years do make their way onto this list, but I'll touch on those films later. Overall, we're going to be analyzing what makes a horror movie great, and then looking at the decline of horror movies and seeing what are the new movies doing that just missed the mark. And to do that, we're going to start by going to the beginning. I went and looked at the first horror movie ever made. This is where we find La Manor du Diable, which I probably butchered the pronunciation on, but this pretty much just means the castle of the devil. For its time, it was pretty impactful. This was back in the day when there was no sound in film, so imagery was everything. It featured demons, ghosts, witches, and a skeleton, all in a haunted castle which transformed into the devil. And just like today's horror movies, this film had no real story. It was just a series of short acts strung together. I'll play one of those acts for you now, so you can kind of get an idea of what we were working with back then. Okay, so we've definitely come a long way since this time. And it would take nearly 40 years for the next truly defining movie of this genre to be released. And that movie is, of course, Dracula. Yes, I'm talking the original Dracula. This was the first instance of sound in film, and they really made it work. On top of that, this movie relied heavily on storytelling. Whereas with the previous movie, there was no story, this movie would be nothing if it didn't have one. Everything from the environment to how the characters were dressed to how the characters interacted, it all played an important purpose in this film. And it all culminated together to give us one beautiful viewing experience. I'm going to give you a prime example of what I'm talking about with this next short clip.
Thanks. It looks very inviting. Ouch. Oh, it's nothing serious. Just a small cut from that paper clip. It's just a scratch.
We, as the audience, know that Dracula wants blood. And so this scene is masterfully building up tension. So, right off the bat, let's take away a few things that we know make a horror movie great. First is sound design, the second is storytelling in all forms, and the third is a good building of tension. It is no wonder that this movie is considered to be one of the best received critically of any of the Universal horror pictures. Even the New York Times stated in a 1963 overview that Dracula and the arrival of sound film began the real triumph of the horror movie genre. Dracula sparked an era of horror that we can call the monster era. Movies that attempted to bring the stories before them to life. Following its success, The Son of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, and even The Son of Dracula were released. And while I would love to make a video talking about all the notable releases of the horror movie genre and what those movies have done for the industry, that is not the point of this video. And if you guys do want to see that, let me know in the comments below. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the next generation of horror movies and what I feel that they brought to the table. These films being The Thing from Another World, released in the 50s, and Psycho, released in the 60s. The Thing from Another World played with our imagination. It created something that we could only really think about in our dreams. It built upon this Thing character, and it didn't give away that character too soon. It also incorporated action and a higher level of pacing to keep us more on the edge of our seat. In my opinion, Psycho took that second part and ran with it, introducing this idea that nothing is more terrifying than a man who is just completely unhinged. This is where I believe the horror genre had its second most defining moment. I'd say that's thanks to director Alfred Hitchcock. And for those unaware, Alfred is regarded as one of the most influential figures in the cinema industry. The movie defied the conformist norms of the movies before, doing away with mysterious characters and delivering more on a bold and unsettling narrative surrounding the murder of Marion Crane. It also contains the infamous shower scene, which, if you don't know, took over 90 cuts in order to suggest violence rather than just throwing violence in our face. The similarity in these two movies is that they play with our minds and they play with what we're thinking while watching the movie. They're making us do the work in our head to put two and two together and come up with an answer ourselves as to what's going on. We end up creating these ideas in scenes in our brain and filling in the blanks, and the result is unnerving. I believe Psycho especially deserves praise in pushing the genre, giving birth to the slasher subgenre and even setting a new standard for film censorship. Yeah, that's right. This was too much for movies back then. On top of that, the musical touch present in Psycho is something that I'm sure everyone watching is familiar with, even if they don't know that it originated in Psycho. Based on everything we just talked about, we can definitely add a few more things to our list of what makes a horror movie great, and that would be playing with the audience's imagination, a good use of practical effects, and technical mastery. And what I mean by technical mastery is just their use of camera work, lighting, etc., in order to create one unified experience. Following the 40s and 50s, we get into the era that most people consider to be the golden age of horror movies. And that's right, I'm talking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The notable movies from this generation definitely had the most impact. And if you account for inflation, they were all bangers at the box office. And while some film critics refer to this as the Renaissance of horror, I don't really think that's the case. It is more suitably the golden age. Because the movies from this generation were all incredible, and they all built off one another in unique ways. And so for that reason, I just find it unnecessary to separate the movies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s into their own categories. It was also movies from this time period that not only kicked off massive franchises, but also did an insane job in creating very deep and unique subgenres of horror. If I had to only pick 5 movies to talk about during this time period, and I will because I don't want this video being an hour long, those 5 movies would be A Nightmare on Elm Street, released in 1984, Friday the 13th, released in 1980, The Shining, released in 1980, the original Halloween, released in 1978, and The Exorcist, released in 1973. These movies are so great that I think they all deserve their own standalone video. And on top of that, I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with these movies themselves, and for that reason, I'm not going to go too big into the nitty-gritty. Instead, I'd rather just focus on what these movies have in common and what we can take away from these movies. When it comes to storytelling, each of these movies brought something new to the genre. From unique monsters and villains to groundbreaking narrative structures. And it was these iconic villains, such as Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger, that have become cultural icons. In each one of these movies, there was just a character and a scene that we cannot forget. Of course, all of these movies nailed cinematography, lighting, sound design. They didn't overuse loud noises or do cliches. They were the movies that came up with what would become the cliches. And on top of that, they made sure to build up their suspense slowly. These films really dove into the psychological fears that are just deeply rooted in our brain. Whether through the demonic possession of The Exorcist, or the relentless stalking in Halloween. Even the dream invasion in A Nightmare on Elm Street, or the isolation in The Shining. Or what about the primal fear of being hunted in Friday the 13th? All of these movies were made to capitalize on our deepest, most primal fears. And I love it. Their cultural impact only highlight this. Each film left a lasting impression on pop culture and the horror genre itself. Unfortunately, whenever there's one commercial success, Hollywood loves to milk it and print out sequels and franchises. Something that kind of tarnishes the legacy of these movies, in my opinion. But that's something I'm going to bring up more later. Because right now, what I think is really crazy and something we should touch on is the fact that none of these movies really had CGI to rely on and work with. This was during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and CGI just wasn't a thing yet. They relied entirely on practical effects. The Exorcist is renowned for its groundbreaking use of special effects makeup, particularly in the transformation of Linda Blair's character. Hell, even the blood flood scene in The Shining is all practical effects. Two of these movies specifically had extremely low budgets, with Halloween having around $300,000 to work with, and Friday the 13th having roughly only $500,000. If you adjust for inflation, this still comes to less than $2 million for a Hollywood movie. Compare that to horror movies today, which average a budget of at least $15 million. It really makes you wonder, is the money being spent in the right places? It would be wrong of me to bring up budgets without bringing up the Blair Witch Project. A movie that went above and beyond, having a return on investment of over 400,000%. The movie was on such a tight budget that the film crew actually had to return their cameras after filming. They had to be creative with how they filmed the movie, and they had to do very unique things because they just didn't have an endless budget to do whatever they wanted. And it paid off. They ended up stomping the box office, clearing nearly $250 million. It just goes to show that having the biggest budgets and the best effects does not carry your movie. At the end of the day, these are the things that mattered the most in every movie we've talked about. The sound design and camera work, obviously, the build-up and release of tension, and most importantly, the underlying story of the movie. These writers were able to get in our heads in ways that others weren't. They manipulated our most primal fears and crafted these unique villains that were very new for the time. Their villains usually had a purpose that was beyond just senseless killing. All of these things came together and it created a storyline that disturbed us on a deeper level than seeing a guy just be very creepy looking and scary, jump out of nowhere and have a very big loud sound effect. So now that we've established what makes the horror genre great, we gotta take a look at the other side. Why have horror movies felt so empty recently? I think the simplest answer is that these movies just don't capture what we talked about before. The sound design in horror movies feels pretty generic by now, and a lot of the sound effects and the ambiance that they're creating, it's coming from places and from sounds and audio that we've heard 1,000 times before. There's also not really this big buildup of tension and then one massive release. Newer movies constantly provide a jump scare, and it's something that audiences, myself included, now we go to these movies and we expect it. There really is no suspense when every time we see someone turning a corner or opening a door or turning around or looking in a mirror. There's no suspense when we're expecting something to happen every time, and it does happen every time. And on top of all that, most of these modern horror movies just don't have a unique story that's good. They don't really leave us feeling disturbed or walking away with something new. Rather, it just feels like everything is so cliche and everything has been done 1,000 times before. And that's because it has. When we experience something for the first time, it feels unique, special, and it leaves us wanting more. But how excited can we really get about the 10th Saw movie or the 13th Halloween film? Don't get me wrong, I'm still going to watch these movies. They're just not going to hit the same. It feels like Hollywood is just reinventing the wheel every time rather than innovating and making something new. And why would they? They already know that by making the same movies, they're going to be able to maximize their profits. They don't have to take a chance on a new director or a new storyteller with a unique idea and trying out new ways of making a film. They already know that they can print money by re-releasing the same type of movie. And that's because we watch them. And hey, I'm part of the problem. I just said how I would still watch the new Halloween movie if it was to come out, and I'm sure many of us watching this would too. But that doesn't mean that I'm not gonna point out the problems with it. I feel like modern movies are relying more and more on their visual effects and pushing the limits of what they can make look real on the screen. And instead of doing that, they should be focusing more on creating a good story. A story that's more of a slow burn, tension build-up experience so they can deliver on it in the end. I would say they're putting way too much time, energy, and money into their CGI. So much so, in fact, that I think in a lot of movies, we, the audience, are able to see through the CGI. A good example of this is the 2011's The Thing. It didn't perform the worst on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's definitely not one of the worst horror movies, but I think it does its job in what I'm using it for, which is to highlight that overuse and poor CGI is going to be noticed by viewers, and it will just result in being less convincing than using practical effects and even detracting from the horror experience itself. The thing with CGI is that when it's good, it's really good. We don't notice it, it doesn't break the immersive experience that we're looking for, and we're able to really enjoy the movie. But when it's bad, all of the opposite is true. We're pulled from the immersive experience, and we feel like the first thing that comes to mind is, wow, that's bad CGI. And that completely ruins the horror experience. I think a wonderful example that proves you don't need CGI to make convincing horror is the transformation scene in The American Werewolf, a movie released in 1981. For those that have not seen it, I'll continue playing the rest of the clip here. And for those who have seen it or just want to skip the clip, you can go to this time here on the screen.
I didn't mean to call him a meatloaf, Jack.
Those older movies, The Shining especially, did so well because they played with psychology and psychological horror rather than just visual shock. I mean, the guy in The Shining looks scary, but if it was just the way he looked that we were comparing things off of, he'd be one of the least horrifying villains in all of the horror. Meanwhile, you go from that end of the spectrum to something like Saw, which is mostly what people would consider to be just gore and like torture horror. And while that is something that is unsettling, it's not going to leave as much of a lasting impression as The Shining. Well, the original few Saw movies maybe, but that's because they also had a really good story to go with it. At least something that I thought was a good story. And if you still don't believe me when I say that modern horror doesn't really compare to the golden age, well, let's just take a look at Rotten Tomatoes' 50 worst horror movies of all time. Of the 50 movies on that list, I want you to take a guess on how many of them were made after the year 2000. Go ahead, guess. I'll give you a few seconds, I'll wait. If your guess was 41, then you're right. Of course, this is not to say that any horror movie made before the year 2000 can't be a stinker. There's a reason 9 of them are on this list. When 82% of the worst horror movies were made in the past 24 years, they tend to leave an impression with us that's going to be greater than that of the good horror movies being good of the last 24 years. When we experience something really great, it's going to stick with us, right? But there have been studies done, and something that is equally negative will actually impact you more than something that is the positive on the other end of the spectrum. And to explain that better, it's basically saying that it feels worse to lose $100 than the feeling of enjoyment you'd get winning $100. But back to the main point I'm making. When 82% of the top 50 worst horror movies of all time were made after the year 2000, it really begs the question, have any great horror movies ever been released in the past 24 years? Well, if you remember in the beginning when I said, what are the best horror movies? You're going to be met with a list that mostly includes movies from before the year 2000. I said mostly because there are a few exceptions. I will highlight Jordan Peele's Us and Get Out as two great examples. Their sound design and camera work was beautiful. The build-up and release of tension was very nice. And the underlying story itself, it was just so good. Get Out is even featured as number 6 on the Rotten Tomatoes best horror movies of all time, so this isn't even my opinion. This is just objective fact at this point. A Quiet Place Parts 1 and 2 also feature spots on the top 25 of this list. Look, I don't really want to give away too much about this movie or the other movies I recommended, because if you haven't watched them, I'd be doing a disservice in trying to explain them to you. It's way better if you were to just watch them on your own. And lastly, something I want to touch on is nostalgia. I often wondered when writing this script, how much did nostalgia play into what I'm talking about? I mean, I was born the year 2000, so I wasn't around when these original movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s came out. But I do remember the first time I watched Saw. I do remember the first time I watched Halloween. I do remember the first time I watched The Exorcist. I remember the first time that I watched all of the movies that I talked about. Well, all the good ones. They all left me feeling pretty disturbed, and considering some of them I saw when I was only like 9, might not have been the best idea. I can't say that I'm tackling this topic objectively, but what I can say is that most of the time when I go to look for a horror movie now, nothing really catches my interest. And I love horror. I used to watch horror movies all the time. I watch a bunch of videos about horror. But regardless, I feel like there's definitely a clear problem and distinction between what makes a horror movie good and what makes a horror movie bad. And the thing that sucks is that the good horror movies that I've been seeing in the past few years, they're usually more like indie style films. So it is definitely a bummer seeing Hollywood just miss the mark over and over again when we have people and creators who can do magnificent things. To everyone who has made it this far, I just want to say thank you for watching through the whole video.